barrel of Gerrican Orzen's lasgun pierced the utter darkness of the corridor before him. Drifting particles of dust danced lazily through the cold light as the sergeant signalled his squad to follow him into the bland octagonal hallway, leading into the innards of the Advent Imperiatus. The ship was completely dark. Not even emergency lumens lit any of the halls and chambers they had passed so far. The boots of the 5 highly trained soldiers rang on the steel-plated floors. Other than that, everything remained eerily quiet.
"This is like a ghost ship," Guardsman Mika voxed to the rest of the squad. "Do you see the hull on our way in? Not a single scratch on her, no battle damage, nothing."
"I know," Tarasel agreed. "How did a single frigate become stranded so far out here? What happened to the rest of the fleet?"
"I know what'll happen to you if you don't start maintaining Vox discipline soon," Sergeant Gerrigan barked. The 5 guardsmen went on in silence, deeper into the vessel and further away from the safety of their dropship, back in the hangar bay.
It is strange, though, Gerrigan thought to himself. The lonely Tempest-class ship had just appeared, drifting through the stars, dark and inert. Imperial authorities had tried hailing the frigate, but all to no avail. Eventually, Gerrican's squad had been dispatched to investigate where the Advent Imperiatus had so suddenly come from. They hadn't met any resistance when their craft entered the hangar bay. Upon arrival, they had found that the ship's generator had still idled, powering the emergency protocols that maintained the flow of recycled air and a stable gravity field. But that was about it. So far, they hadn't found any sign of the crew. After a short while, they reached a junction. One passage led towards the bridge, while the other went deeper into the guts of the frigate, where the crew compartments and Medicae stations would be.
"Tarasel, Isrin, you check the lower decks," Gerrican ordered. "Mika, halt. You're with me. We'll see if there's someone on the bridge. Keep your weapon spirits watchful."
"Come on, Iz," Tarasel said, shouldering his plasma gun as he marched into the left corridor. As Isrin followed, Gerrican caught himself looking after her longer than he intended. His younger sister had joined the 105th Falkenberg Wardrakes not long ago, and the pride he felt was still fresh. She had doggedly fought her way through the harsh recruitment tithing and the brutal training of the regiment in the very next intake after Gerrican himself determined that she should join the same tithe uptake, and thus the same regiment as him. Isrin hadn't done this out of some misplaced need for his company or protection. Rather, she had always been determined not to let Gerrican outpace her in anything. Sure enough, she was an exceptional soldier, but the sergeant could not simply brush aside that he was her superior now. He couldn't treat her differently than any other of his warriors.
"You coming, Sarge?" Mika asked. "Does the Emperor sit in a golden throne?" Gerrican replied.
"Move to the bridge." The bridge of the Advent Imperiatus seemed as lifeless and dark as the rest of the ship.
"Emperor's eye, I do not understand this," Gerrican muttered. "Let's spread out, Vigilantus pattern. Mika, you take the right flank. Halt, you're on the left."
The other 2 guardsmen acknowledged his command with short vox clicks and lifted their lasguns. Mika prowled off to the far right side of the bridge. His lumen danced over dark screens and servitor stations.
"Do you see that?" he voxed.
Slumped servitors hung in their mountings, still connected to tactical data shrines and cognitor stations. They looked malnourished, and dead, but there was no obvious cause.
"Hold position, Mika," Garrican voxed. "Halt. Investigate the other flank."
As soon as his voice ceased, Holt was off to the left. Her lumen swiveled through the darkness as she made for the next vantage point. The light suddenly jerked upwards as she fell.
"Halt, come in," Garrican called.
"I'm all right," she answered, breathing heavily. I tripped over someone. He's dead, like the servitors." Garrican advanced to Holt's position, heart thudding against his ribs.
"What in the Emperor's name is going on here?"
"He looks like he just lay down and never got up," Holt commented as he arrived. She was right. The man just lay there, collapsed like a forgotten rag doll. Garrican nodded and snuck forward silently to check the rest of the bridge. He kept a keen eye on his surroundings, but there were no life signs, just more dead crew members. The corpses all looked gaunt and haggard, as if they had simply fallen into a coma or starved to death, sunken over their stations.
"No life signs,"
he voxed as he reached the command throne in the center of the bridge. He frowned as he looked upon the ship's deceased commander. The shipmaster's eyes were wide open, glassy, staring at the ceiling. Garrican shuddered.
"Are these war drakes? There's no one here but the dead. May the Emperor protect their souls."
"There must be a reason for all this, sir," Holt replied. "People don't simply fall over and die."
Garrican nodded. "I agree, Mika. Awaken the data extractor and hook it up. Let's see if we can get some of the cognitor banks up and running. Maybe they can spit out anything about what's happened here. In the meantime, let's hope that Tizarel and Isrin have had more luck."
The plated doorway before Isrin opened with a soft hiss as she punched the activation rune. "All right," she muttered. "We should find the Medicaid station down there. And maybe some answers," she thought.
Zariel nodded. "Quick sweep of the outer chambers, then advance to the crew compartments. The sooner we're done here, the better. I don't like this place at all."
Isrin nodded. "You'll take point," she decided. "I'd prefer to have your plasma gun between me and whatever we find down there." Tazariel shrugged and lifted his weapon, thumbing its activation rune. The plasma coil illuminated their surroundings in a soft blue light and hummed gently. The squad's weapons specialist took a step towards the doorway.
"Zariel Crestlin of the 105th Falkenberg War Drake speaking," he shouted into the darkness, his voice augmented by the helmet's internal vox gear. "Can anyone hear me?"
The silence only seemed to become louder. Isrin could feel it almost breezing over her from the darkness like a chilly wind. Zariel looked at her. The red shimmer of his bionic eye implant mixed with the blue glow of his plasma weapon.
"Let's go,"
he said, and advanced into the next chamber. Isrin followed him and let her lumen wander over the hall that opened behind the doorway.
"I think we found the crew,"
Zariel breathed as he took in the scene before him. Isrin's skin crawled as the light of her lumen travelled through the Medicaid station, brushing over row after row of dormant figures on gurneys. They were hooked to blinking life support shrines. Several gurneys had toppled over. People were strapped to some of them, alive, but completely inert. Others had rolled from their sickbeds, ripping out the life support wires in the process. They seemed to have starved where they lay. Strewn between them were the Medicaid themselves, as gaunt and malnourished as their patients. A thin film of spilled nutritional liquid covered the floor and dripped from life support systems, only half hooked to people who wouldn't need them anymore. It looks as if something just made them drop into a coma of sorts, one after another, Isrin whispered.
They must have known,
Azariel said, nodding towards a dead Medicae adept on the floor.
They tried to save as many as they could before it took them as well. Anyone not hooked into life support just starved.
But why? Isrin wondered, still trying to process the macabre scene in front of her. What happened?
Only the Emperor knows,
Azariel replied. Isrin noticed that his grip around the plasma gun had tightened.
Better let the sergeant know what we found.
Isrin nodded and opened a Vox communication. Isrin to Gerrican. A short click indicated that her brother was listening. We found an improvised Medicae station on the crew decks, she continued. Multiple dead, other crew hooked into life support, but they're dormant. Anyone who's not connected to life support is dead.
Suggest wake.
Gerrican's voice came in, chopped. Isrin tapped on the Vox bead of her helmet. Gerrican? Sergeant?
Repeat. Wake.
Blasted thing, she cursed. Something's blocking the Vox signal down here to Zariel. Zariel nodded.
Think we should try waking one of them up for questioning?
I suppose, Isrin answered, and approached the closest gurney. She carefully avoided stepping into a rotting Medicae servitor next to it, and eyed the blinking control station of the life support system the man was hooked into. Mandela pattern type 4, she muttered. Isrin punched a series of Imperial standard codes into the control panel and intoned the few catch-all prayers she knew for rousing machine spirits. They should bring him back into the Emperor's service. The soft hum came from the life support system as it pumped drugs into the dormant patient. Isrin took a step back, lifted her lasgun, and aimed it at the comatose man. A side glance told her that Zariel had his weapon aimed as well. A few moments passed, but the man just lay there, as unmoving and inert as the ship itself. Isrin took a deep breath and closed in on him, almost reluctantly. Ever so slowly she bowed down. Eventually she could hear his breath coming in a slow, flat rhythm. His chest barely moved, but he was definitely alive. He just didn't seem to actually be in there. Isrin was about to say something, but the words caught in her throat as Azariel groaned behind her. She whirled around, instincts kicking in instantly as she aimed her lasgun. Cruel silver claws protruded from her comrade's stomach. Before Isrin could react any further, Azariel was violently lifted and hurled across the room, crashing into a row of gurneys. That was not the reason why she started screaming. Isrin squeezed the trigger of her lasgun, aiming it towards Azariel's killer as it sprang into sudden motion and rushed towards her. Isrin, I repeat, don't try to wake anybody up down there, Gerrican shouted into his vox, although he knew the connection had been interrupted. Emperor's eye, he cursed, looking back onto the unsteady flickering monitor of the cognitor systems. He felt a thick knot tightening in his throat. Pack everything together, Mika. We have all the information that we need. Let's meet up with Isrin and Zariel, and we'll evacuate. Mika nodded and started furling up the data extractor's cables with practiced movements. Gerrican was glad he did not have to look upon the images they had extracted from the cognitor banks any longer. The Imperial authorities had to know as soon as possible. Extractor is appeased, Sarge, Mika said eventually. Acknowledged. Move out, Wardrakes. Let's get our comrades. Holt hesitated. Wait a second, she said. Your specs is picking something up. She hadn't even finished her sentence when Gerrican felt a sudden tingling sensation in his stomach, as if he was dropping into a deep abyss. The air around them sizzled. Move, now! The sergeant shouted, breaking into a run. 3 blinding green flashes of energy burst in midair, and nightmarish creatures stepped from them. They were humanoid in shape, but their bodies were cast from a brass-coloured alloy metal. As Garrican looked in horror, one of the things turned around towards him, its single eye glowing unsympathetically as it raised a ghostly glowing gun and fired. Garrican skidded beneath the burst of deathly energy and cursed as sparks from a damaged console behind him rained down. Holt had no such luck. One of the metal creatures shot her in the head, and she collapsed, dead before she hit the ground. Mika managed to loose a salvo of lasfire into the back of Holt's killer. A row of molten craters appeared on the stooped thing's carapace, but the metal started moving and flowed back together. Only seconds later, it seemed as if Mika had never fired any shots at the creature. The thing turned towards the guardsman, impossibly fast, methodically returning fire. It unerringly hit Mika's head. He fell silently against a navigation console and lay still. Garrican cursed and drew his power sword. The three metal figures ignored him for the moment and stalked towards Mika's body. They want the data extractor, Garrican realized. He had to act fast. "For the Emperor!" he shouted, and ran towards the nearest creature. The metal warriors turned to face him, and the two shots cooked the air over his head as he let himself fall. His momentum carried him onwards, and his power sword sliced through the shins of one of the metal monstrosities. As the thing collapsed, Garrican rushed towards Mika and grabbed the data extractor. Then he was at the bridge door, diving headlong through its frame as more energy beams punched into the surrounding walls. Garrican responded in kind, tossing a frag grenade behind him. "That ought to keep the blasted things occupied," he muttered to himself. As he rushed down the dark corridor, his thoughts wandered to his sister. He wanted to go get her, wanted to escape with her, but he knew his duty. He clutched the data extractor tighter. Duty always came first. He couldn't treat her any differently. He had to reach the dropship. He had to get out of this ship and report of what he had seen. The light from his lumen jumped through the black corridor unsteadily. Garrican panted heavily as he pressed onwards. His heart hammered in his chest, and he expected his life to be snuffed out by a shot to the back of the head at any second. But the shot never came, and he eventually reached the Advent Imperiatus hangar bay. "Get the engines running," Garrican foxed as he ran towards the waiting craft. The hatch of the dropship's crew compartment opened, and a hunched silhouette stepped outside, unrecognizable in the darkness of the hangar. "What are you doing? Get the engines running," Garrican repeated, hurrying closer. "Garrican, I'm so glad you made it," his sister answered. Garrican stopped in his tracks, and his heart seemed to skip a beat. "Isrin," he whispered. She had made it after all. She had actually survived. They would escape this nightmare together. "Yes, brother," the figure said, and came closer. As it stepped into the light of Garrican's lumen, the sergeant felt the strength sapping out of his body, and he sank to his knees. "No, Isrin, no." The skin of his sister was draped around the metal frame of the thing that prowled towards him. Beneath the empty holes where her blue eyes once sat, callous green lenses watched him, observing his every reaction with cold intent. With every step, blood dripped from the nightmarish apparition. "Brother," the monster repeated, modulating the voice of his sister to perfection. Garrican closed his eyes and welcomed its embrace.